Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome back for the second time Reiner Kuhr. He is an energy technology economist, and he is affiliated with the Center for Academic Collaboration Initiatives. Reiner, welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast, Robert.
So we talked back in May of 2021, and that was your first appearance, and we talked about nuclear, we talked about the blackouts in Texas, and a number of things. But you've been working on a new paper on energy issues or electricity grid issues in New England. But before we get to that, you know the ground rules here. Guests introduce themselves. So if you don't mind, please introduce yourself.
Sure. I was born in Germany. I immigrated to the U.S. when I was young, when my father joined the space program. After becoming a chemical engineer, I spent 45 years in the power industry. First 25 involved with engineering and developing new technologies and ultimately marketing and managing power projects. The last 20 years, I got into advising on transactions. I was involved as technical advisor for over $70 billion worth of new projects and transactions, and did a lot of business planning with new technologies, including SMRs. And
Gotcha.
after retirement, I started teaching energy technology, economics, and policy at grad school, and I formed the Center for Academic Collaboration Initiatives to try to access a wider base of students and faculty.
And where do you live, Reiner?
Cape Cod. It's a beautiful day on Cape Cod today. How's it in Austin?
It's cool, thankfully. We had a little rain earlier this week, and finally it's cooled off here because it's been stinking hot. And I don't want to get too technical, but stupid hot, maybe even. So let's jump right in here, Reiner, because we've talked several times over the past few months about the work that you've been doing, and you've done a recent report on New England. And I think it's really the reason I wanted to have you on is because you're taking a very bearish view on renewables and their ability to reduce carbon emissions at scale, but also on batteries. And the paper is called Technical and Economic Limits for Renewable Power Integration in New England. Can you summarize that report for us, if you don't mind?
Sure. The areas that I focused on were the higher costs. If you look at unsubsidized cost and you look at how much carbon is reduced, you can estimate carbon abatement cost as a figure of merit for deciding how much you should subsidize renewables. And those numbers came out very high. And the second issue had to do with the timing and flexibility. And right now, New England has enough inflexible clean generation, which includes nuclear, wind, solar, hydro, imports from Canada, and some other generation that covers most of your lower loads. So when you have the lowest loads of the year, most of that generation comes from inflexible technology. And the plans are to double existing wind and solar, add batteries, and develop a lot of offshore wind, which will overload the grid with inflexible power. That's what I was trying to illustrate in the report and evaluate how much that's going to cost us and what we're going to end up with for CO2 emissions.
And you said there's one part here, because this is, you use the social cost of carbon, which is a number that's frankly it's made up, right? About, well, what does CO2 emissions cost society, right? This is the social cost of carbon, and I'm summarizing here. You found, I'm quoting, investments in grid connected solar and wind power generation cost 2 to 6 times the current social cost of carbon policy guidelines. Investment in behind-the-meter distributed solar installations exceeds social cost of carbon by a factor of 15. The cost of using battery storage to lower carbon emissions by reducing wasted surpluses is 7 to 19 times the current social cost of carbon guideline. So you found here is something that's running against the flavor of the moment, which is a lot of academics from elite universities saying, oh, well, of course we can just integrate all these renewables and it's all going to be great, 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 no problem. We're going to build lots of high voltage transmission, but you're taking a tack that says, no, this is exactly the wrong way to go. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and that's why I call myself an energy technology economist, because there's a lot of energy economists that haven't fully um, understood the timing and grid operational issues that put limits on how much renewables you can put in to effectively reduce CO2. So the whole point is to understand how far you can go economically before you're doing more damage to the economy than you are potentially improving our future climate. And a lot of these state climate plans don't address the costs of these plans and the economic effectiveness of them. So by doing these calculations, looking at carbon abatement costs, how much money are you spending? What are you getting in return for carbon reductions? Shows us that a lot of these technologies, like rooftop solar, which I believe you have on your house,
I do.
are very expensive, partly because of the economies of scale and the nature of the design. You are making power at several times, maybe 10 times the cost of wholesale power from the grid if you take into account unsubsidized costs. You strip away the tax credits and the clean energy credits, net metering. Um, that's not a very productive investment. And you start planning in New England $60 billion of new investments to double existing wind and solar and to develop offshore wind. And you start applying some metrics to that. How much CO2 are you really reducing for that money? And what are you doing to the grid? Are you going to eliminate the chances that we'll have affordable and reliable electricity in 10 or 20 years by pushing renewables too far? And that's what we're focused on.
Well, well, there are a lot of questions that pop into my mind, Reiner, and we've talked about these offline before. But one of the points that I think is really critical that you're making, and you've made in other analyses, is that the importance of keeping existing nuclear plants online. And you made this point in your synopsis. You found that if wind and solar would adding more wind and solar would reduce CO2 emissions by up to 21 million metric tons per 21 million tons per year, but retiring the remaining nuclear plants in New England because they would have insufficient revenue. Their revenue would be impacted by this addition of wind and solar. Could increase CO2 emissions by 34 million tons per year. So you're pointing out that if you add more renewables, you risk running the nuclear plants out of business, and if you do that, you're actually going to increase CO2, which is there are several things in your report that I think are remarkable, worth talking about, but that seems to be one of the biggest ones, right? And you've made this point that keeping existing nuclear plants open and operating is the cheapest option. And yet, am I understanding your point here is that if we go ahead New England does willy-nilly adding more solar and wind, you could kill the plants that are absolutely the cheapest way to go in terms of future abatement. Have I got this correct?
That's exactly right. I mean, when we talked earlier about retiring Indian Point or and Pilgrim, that had a huge impact on CO2 emissions, which you've talked about in some of your other podcasts. So.
Right.
What happens when you put too much inflexible generation into the grid, you create surpluses. And in New England, if you're running a wind farm and you're getting a performance tax credit or clean energy credits, you only get those when you operate. So if somebody tells you to shut down, you can choose to bid negative into the grid, give back some of the subsidy in order to not be curtailed. Somebody else gets curtailed that doesn't bid as negative as you do, right? So that's a very awkward thing to happen in a competitive market. I mean, think about any market.
Sure.
If the government comes in and pays somebody a lot of money, gives somebody a huge subsidy to produce too much of a product, and what does that do to all the other suppliers, right? You're interfering. You're interfering with a competitive market by subsidizing surpluses. And in the power market, the victim is the nuclear plants. And when we modeled out to 2030 and we added all of the wind and offshore wind and solar, up to 30 to 40% of the time we'd have negative prices. And the three nukes in New England need about $1 billion a year to cover fuel and operating costs. And that's why nuclear plants have to operate all the time to be economical. If you can't make money 30 or 40% of the time, and it might be worse than that in terms of how much revenue they make, you need to subsidize them by $500 million a year. And if you look at the new IRA support for existing nuclear plants, it's very small compared to that. It's intended to cover the effect of low gas prices, not the effect of competition from renewables. So,
But isn't that just incredible? Well, it's incredible, isn't it, that in the name of climate change and that and really the focus being that on renewables, right? Just for the sake of renewables, right? There's a big church of renewables that wind and solar are the way to go. That by pushing too much renewables into the system, you actually make the system more fragile and more expensive for consumers, and the CO2 goes up. I want to summarize your work because it's very, a lot of what you've done is pretty technical, but is that the main punchline here?
yeah, a lot of climate plans assume nuclear plants will keep running because they're such an important part of reducing CO2. And they don't take a look at the effect of surpluses and the revenue that nuclear plants need. So if you spend $60 billion and reduce carbon emissions by 10 or 11 million tons per year, and then shut down three nukes that put 16 million tons a year back in, you've shot yourself in the foot, right? The best thing to do would have just been to keep running the nuclear plants as long as you can, maybe build new nukes if they become economical, and limit the amount of renewables to the level where they don't interfere substantially with the grid. And the opposite is taking place. And this failure to recognize that you have to make a choice between the two. You can either go nuclear or you can go renewable, but you can't really do both. If you go down the road for renewables, like New England is planning and New York is planning, you're making it very difficult for nuclear to survive. When nuclear fails, your emissions go up more, and you haven't gained anything. You come out behind. You end up with higher emissions. You spend $60 billion, and you end up with more emissions by 2030 than you have right now. So this relationship between keeping nuclear plants running to minimize CO2 emissions and trying to replace them with wind and solar just fundamentally doesn't work, right? It doesn't work economically.
Well, it's interesting. I like that line. You can go nuclear or go renewable, but you can't do both. Or if you try to do both, I guess it ends in tears. Is that it would be the other way to think about it? Because otherwise you're going to have to subsidize both of them heavily to make both of them kind of work. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think people misunderstand the term base load, right? You hear base load a lot, and
so define that. Go ahead, then define that. What does that mean then?
so to give you an example, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, we were talking to the guys out at Solar Reserve in, out west. They have these big solar thermal plants, 100 megawatt solar thermal plants, and they put in molten salt storage.
Right.
So they run for 8 hours. They charge up the hot storage tank, and then they put in a turbine generator that runs base load 24/7, right? So
Right.
you got solar energy 8 hours stored in hot salt tanks, and they wanted to design a base load plant. And I was telling them that, base load isn't really a blessing. Base load is a liability because you're building a plant that has to run all the time. And when nuclear was first developed in the 70s, there were a lot of regions that didn't need power all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So TVA and up in New England built a lot of pumped storage units, and the pumped storage units worked together with base load units to give you the flexibility to make power when you needed it and not make power when you don't need it. So when they shut down a lot of the nukes in New England, the pumped hydro plants aren't making much money because now they're charging when there's combined cycle plants running at low loads and discharging when there's older combined cycle plants, and they don't make much money on arbitrage, and they make some money on ancillary services. So the market for base load plants starts to disappear when your load shape is occupied more and more by wind and solar. Because if you think about it, a nuclear plant wants to run all the time, except for when it's being refueled and maintained, maybe a
Right.
month every year and a half or 2 years, right?
Right.
So it wants to run all the time. It doesn't change load in response to demand. Nuclear and wind and solar try to do the same thing, right? A wind farm wants to run all the time whenever wind is available, and a solar farm wants to run all the time whenever sunlight is available, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't care about loads. They don't respond to changes in demand. So in that sense, nuclear is just as inflexible as wind and solar. And when you start piling these on top of each other, you got too much energy that doesn't respond to changes in the power grid, right?
I see. So now I see when you say inflexible, that's what you, because when you used that term before, I thought, well, I don't quite understand what he's saying there, but this is
Yeah.
because they want to run when they want to run, I guess
Right.
would be
So,
the,
and certain, there's run of river hydro. It either runs or you spill the water, right? And there's landfill gas. So there's a lot of inflexible generation that's not responsive to the grid, and the grid operator can't use it to control the grid, right? How
so
does the grid
what you,
operator
so ideally
control?
what you want is a gas fired generation or something else that has, or, I mean, if you think about what's the most dispatchable and most energy secure, it'd be a diesel fired genset, right? You got a big tank full of diesel and you can run that thing whenever you want, right?
Right.
I mean, because you've got on-site fuel and you can, I mean, you could even say that, I suppose, of a coal plant, right? You know, the same would be true there. You have on-site fuel, you can switch it on and off, although coal isn't as fast ramping as diesel gensets. But is that fair that that would be the ultimate inflexible, flexible generation?
Right. So you need flexibility just to be able to control the grid, just like any
Right,
system.
right.
And you got your low loads at 2 in the morning are half as big as your high loads at 7 p.m. in the evening, right? And you got to connect the two. The only thing that connects the two in New England most of the time is gas generation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, gas generation also makes most of the CO2 in the grid, right?
Right.
So you're trying to eliminate carbon emissions and you're going after the only flexible generation in the system,
Oh, you're
right?
going after the only flexible. So you're saying going after gas-fired generation then?
Right. So if your only flexibility is provided by gas and you want to get rid of gas to achieve zero, carbon zero or something, what's going to take its place? How are you going to provide that flexibility, right? And and you can visualize it, the timing, by looking at a daily average load curve, and you see that most of the generation is in the evenings. Most of the CO2 is produced, between 6 and 9 p.m. in the evenings when the older gas plants run. And all of the solar generation happens midday,
Right.
more in the summer, very little in the winter in New England. And then the wind, you can think of it as running once every 2 or 3 days, right? Wind runs 30, 40, maybe more percent of the time, but you can visualize it as 1 out of every 2 or 3 days you have wind, right? So if
Mm,
most of let's say half of your CO2 emissions are in the evening, and you don't have any solar generation other than the longest few days of the year that impact that,
right.
and you only have wind every 2 or 3 days, no matter how much wind you put in or how much solar you put in, you're not going to be able to do much with a good percentage of your CO2 emissions, right? You keep making
Because
more energy at the wrong times.
they're concentrated and will remain concentrated at a certain window in the day in that
Yeah.
24-hour period.
Yeah, in the evening, when you get home and you turn on your air conditioner and you
Right.
start cooking and
Yeah.
plug in your electric car, all those things push the demand up during a time of day that's very difficult for renewables to address, right? And then you start looking at batteries. Well,
Good. I'm
everybody
glad you.
thinks
I
that if
want to
you
talk about batteries. Well, so let me. Can I preface that because
sure.
you talk about batteries. Oh, where is the? I've got this. Yeah, you wrote that addition of bulk battery energy storage is extremely expensive and ineffective in reducing surpluses from further expansion of wind and solar. and then you put some numbers on it. I'm trying to find the numbers, but why are okay? Well, here's my bias. Batteries stink. They always stink. They're better, but they're kind of like Goldilocks, right? You can't charge them too fast. You can't charge them too slow. You can't make it can't be too hot. Can't be too cold. And if we're gonna have extreme weather like we did here in February of last year, I don't want any batteries. I want a big honking tank of kerosene or diesel fuel or something. I don't want to rely on a battery when it's cold. My
So
bias.
typically, I'm sorry. So typically, a battery is designed for like a 4-hour discharge, right?
Right.
And 4 hours isn't 4 hours isn't bad if you can do it every day. But the problem with surpluses is they happen unevenly. So you get a lot of surpluses when you get a lot of solar in the spring, April and May. You're going to have a lot of energy before noon, before the loads are high. Wind energy, you could end up with a lot of wind at 2 in the morning when the loads are the lowest, right? And you can try to pick that up with batteries to the extent you put in enough capacity. And the more capacity you put in, the less surpluses you pick up. It's just statistical, right?
Right.
And if you put in a lot of batteries to capture all those surpluses in 10 or 20% of the year when they happen, then those batteries don't run much the rest of the year, right? You're putting in a lot of capacity that's not utilized. Anything that's expensive, you want to utilize a lot, or you got to pay off the capital.
Sure.
And the amount of energy you're moving is small. You're going to pay an enormous amount just to move that energy, and you're losing 15% of it when you move it, right? You got to discharge cycle efficiency. So when you run the numbers, you can either put in a lot of batteries that are very expensive and you can recover a significant amount of the surpluses, but then those batteries don't run much and they get very expensive to pay off, assuming you're putting them in there to reduce CO2 emissions.
Right.
And the rest of the year, if you try to charge and discharge a battery, you could be increasing CO2 emissions, because if you're running gas plants when you're charging the batteries and you're running gas plants when you're discharging the batteries, you right off the top, you're losing 15% of that energy and increasing the CO2 emissions by 15%, although that's offset because sometimes you have higher emitting combined cycles, older combined cycles, or even peakers. And the only time that you can extend the use of solar and wind energy is when they're surpluses.
And so you're
right?
talking more about not just daily shifting, but you're talking about what it would be in terms of seasonal shifting. Isn't this what is that the gist of where you're going with this?
No, I was making the point that if you put in a battery to reduce CO2 emissions, the only time it reduces CO2 emissions is if you're using high emitting peakers in the evening, or if you've got surplus solar and wind to charge it with. And that doesn't happen very often, right?
I see. So the batteries are only valuable if you have surplus wind and solar that you can then use to displace gas-fired generation during those peak moments when they would normally run.
Right. So if you got a lot of surpluses, like in California, I think California claims they only have 5% of their renewables is curtailed, but they're paying Arizona and Nevada to take it, and
Right.
they're paying people not to take power and stuff. So it's once you're making too much renewables, you're already in trouble, right? And then the batteries give you a very limited ability to recover from that, economically and from the standpoint of CO2 emissions. Batteries have a new market now in Texas. They're financing new battery projects to provide ancillary services, which means that the power from an inverter-based generation lacks sufficient quality from a voltage control standpoint that they have to use batteries now to fix that. So you could kind of assign the cost of these battery projects to the wind industry because they're creating unstable voltage conditions because the inverters aren't doing a good job of matching grid voltages, right? So that's kind of an interesting way to look at the new market for batteries. There's a new market there because of the failure of inverter-based technologies
the problems created. The
power
problems,
quality.
the power quality, the problems created by asynchronous generation, by by
Yeah.
the wind and solar, which are not synchronous, right,
You
by
should
nature.
charge them for the batteries that have to be put in to fix that, right?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because there is a company that's been operating in Texas and apparently making a good bit of money, Jupiter Power, and they well, I've asked to talk to some of their people, have not gotten a positive response yet. But so their battery companies that are operating in the ERCOT grid, you're saying, are making their money off ancillary services, and they're making that money because of the grid instability caused by renewables. Is that what you're saying?
That's the way I understand it. There's some people you could talk to get more details on that, but the people that are following projects are seeing these privately financed projects that are driven by revenue from ancillary services, which the ERCOT goes out and contracts for to maintain power quality. And then that gets paid for by everybody, right? So that's kind of another subsidy that you're paying for these ancillary services as part of your electric bill. And some of it is unique to responding to what these what this inverter-based generation does to the grid. So, if you try to do some energy economics around the whole thing and try to understand how much more money we're paying for things to get the CO2 emissions down, you should take all of these into account. It's just like transmission and distribution improvements, right? Those aren't accounted for very clearly. And if you put too much distributed solar rooftop in a neighborhood, you got to rebuild the whole distribution system to allow two-way flow of power and keep the system safe for workers. And a lot of that cost is carried by regulated utilities who just pass it along to ratepayers, and it's not even clearly reported in your electric bill how much of what you're paying is happening to support renewables,
Right.
right? How many, that big transmission corridor across Texas to bring more wind in from Western Texas to Eastern Texas,
Right.
who paid for that? And is that really a subsidy, or is that something that should have happened anyway? If you're trying to justify subsidies for wind and a greater role for wind and solar, you have to take all of these things into account. It's very difficult to understand transmission and distribution investments and how much of that is being spent on strictly because you're trying to expand solar and wind. And the distribution companies are regulated utilities. So the more work they're allowed to do and more money they put in the rate base, the more profitable their business is. So they're not going to stand up and say, you shouldn't be doing this, or it's only due to your policy.
Sure. So let me just follow on the batteries because I found the number here, and this is from your paper again. And my guest is Reiner Kuhr again. I'm just repeat. You can find him on LinkedIn or at the Center for Academic Collaboration Initiatives, which is centeraci.com. Reiner's on his second appearance on the podcast, but you wrote in your paper about renewables in New England. You said that unsubsidized battery storage costs add $150 to $500 per megawatt hour, depending on their utilization when recovering surplus wind and solar generation. So to tie that back to the social cost of carbon, which under the Biden administration you point out is $51 per ton. So batteries, if you try and add in batteries, you're going to be paying 3x or 3x to 10x
Right,
roughly.
and that's just to move the energy. You're not creating any energy. That's just to capture surplus energy and bring it back to when you can use it, right? So it doesn't make much sense. Now, the social cost of carbon is worth talking about for a minute.
Yeah,
And,
sure, please do.
there was a huge study done by the Office of Management and Budget where they took climate models and predicted future extreme weather, floods, loss of agricultural production, deaths, anything. And this was a massive study that was peer reviewed by people apparently that supported that approach. And there were lawsuits filed against its use that are still pending. And so this is, if you stop, when I talk to my class about the social cost of carbon, people start to realize what's happening, right? What is the cost of not doing anything? That's what the social cost of carbon is supposed to represent,
Hmm.
right? Let's keep running our gas plants. Let's keep heating our homes with gas. Let's keep driving our cars with gasoline. What is the penalty we're going to pay for doing that, right? And if you try to do it in economic terms, it's really monetizing the environmental deterioration that will happen through climate change, right?
Right.
And that goes back to the whole chain of logic of what happens if we do a lot and the rest of the world doesn't, right? Is the
In
social
terms of
cost of carbon still
in terms of
$51?
climate mitigation, if right. So,
Yeah, I mean,
okay, go ahead.
some of your other podcasts had some excellent speakers that talk about how the rest of the world is expanding its use of fossil uh, energy and increasing CO2 emissions. And here we are in New England, and we think by spending $60 billion and reducing carbon emissions by 11 million tons a year, we're going to be protecting our grandchildren from negative effects of climate change. But, that's not even considering that shutting down the nuclear plants increases the emissions in the first place.
Sure.
So I think there's the social cost of carbon is worth, even though it's heavily disputed, the whole idea of how much you should spend to get rid of a ton of carbon is a very worthy topic because it sets a policy basis. And without a policy basis, there's no limit to how much you can spend,
Right.
right? There's
So
no
you're saying that, so you're
prioritization.
saying this is the benchmark then. If this is and this is the benchmark set out by this administration as what we think this is going to cost of not doing anything, then that it becomes your metric that you then compare other mitigation strategies against. And
Right.
that's the nut of what you're trying to do here.
And when you calculate the social cost of carbon of all the alternatives, the only one that fits within that criterion is extending the life of nuclear plants.
So okay, repeat that because I think you made this point before, and I've quoted you in several articles. I think, but your point is that if $51 per ton is the social cost of carbon, keeping existing nuclear plants online is the only thing that costs less than $51 a ton. Is that what you've said?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
So, looking at it very simply like that, we have a policy guideline that's set by the federal government, and of course it's disputed, and some people are going to want to make it a lot higher to justify a lot of these technologies. But, where do you draw the line? Where do you say we're doing more economic damage than environmental benefit,
Right.
right? And to me, that's the dotted line, right? And it may not be a accurate number that people agree on, but it's a policy directive, right? If you don't know anything else and you pick a number and you say, go for it, spend that much money and don't spend any more, right? That's what policy is all about. I try to teach my students what policy is. It's very difficult to explain what policy is, right? Policy translates into money, into economics. And then
Right.
based on the policy, people will build things or retire things or make investments. People's electric bills will go up to pay for things. You're socializing the whole power industry by causing the subsidies to be much larger than the whole value of the power market. If you play these numbers out, um, people are building. And before I retired, I was looking at a lot of new projects, and they used to hire a market consultant and look at the cash flows, see that the banks are going to get paid with a high level of certainty. And all the money would be based on market revenue. And then towards the end, when they were financing a lot of renewable utility scale projects, the money shifted to subsidies, right? You're basically financing and building plants where most of the money is coming from subsidies, not from the market, right?
Right.
So what does that tell you? It means you're socializing what we just considered a privatized power market, right? We just went through this massive, painful shift of deregulation to allow competition, but now we're through these subsidies, clean energy credits, operating tax credit, performance tax credits.
Right.
That's driving the projects now, not what the grid needs. You're not responding to the fact that, gee, these plants are going to retire, so it creates more of an opportunity to take over that market share. No, we're going to get most of our money from these tax credits. They expire in 5 or 10 years. Let's build it, make as much money as we can, and it's private investment is a very short-term thing, right? You're
Right.
looking at a very high cost of capital. You got to recover in 5 or 10 years. There's no strategic planning there, right? The
And see,
only
and I think if
strategic planning comes out of the grid operator, and they have very limited abilities to do that in a privatized market.
right. Well, you make a key point here, Reiner, and I want to pursue that because I completely agree with you. And talking with people in the power business, it's clear that the investment tax credit, mainly for solar, and the production tax credit, mainly for wind, completely distorting the power markets. I mean, I see it here in Texas that by the end of next year, with this looming onslaught of new wind and solar coming into the ERCOT market, that by the end of 2023, there will be more wind and solar capacity in the Texas market than there is gas-fired capacity. It's going to, and it won't be close. It's going to be something like 20, well, not quite 20,000 megawatts, but something on the order of that. I mean, it's a huge, huge increase. But that the investments that are being made in grid-connected generation aren't being driven by affordability, resilience, and reliability. They're being driven by tax credit policy, and that to me is just you've got it exactly backwards. And as I'm formulating these ideas, I'm talking to you, but I've been familiar with it for a while. Am I missing something here? Because that's what I'm paraphrasing what you said, but combining it with what I see in ERCOT. Is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm troubled by the concept of subsidized surpluses, right? And maybe it's a difficult term,
I
but
like
you're
that. Troubled by subsidized surpluses. So we
right.
we
You
already
and
have
I
a
are
warehouse full of bread, but we're going to subsidize them making more bread.
we're
And
gonna
but
we're gonna make too many shoes and give somebody $5 for every pair of shoes that they come and pick up at the store, right? So it's very wasteful, and it's counterproductive because now you're hurting the parts of the competitive market that aren't subsidized, right? You're picking technologies as winners. And if you don't pick nuclear as a winner, nuclear becomes the loser. If you try to
mm,
subsidize both nuclear and wind and solar at the same time, now you got battling subsidies, right?
and
You
that's
got
what
to
we're seeing.
subsidize one more to keep it alive, and then the other one you got to subsidize because they're trying to do the same thing.
Right.
They're
And
trying
that's
to
what we're
occupy the
seeing. I mean,
same
and
part of
that's
the
what
market.
we've seen in several states. In Illinois, right? They passed legislation to subsidize the nuclear plants. Well, why are some of the plants in trouble? Because their profits are being undermined by the renewables. But let me ask something, I guess, Reiner, that it keeps recurring to me, and I've interviewed a lot of people in my career, and I've talked to people who are big promoters of renewables, and I've talked to politicians. Why is it I'll ask you the question as directly as I can. Why do so few people understand the economics of electricity and the electricity business? Why it seems to me very few people really grasp the complexities of the grid as a thing and as a machine. Why is it so hard to understand?
Well, I think there's several things. One, there is this pervasive ideology that getting rid of fossil will improve our climate in the future, no
Mm.
matter how much you spend or how, just do it, get rid of it all. And
And
that's what's
no cost is too high.
no cost, the costs, people will figure out how to do it economically. Just tell them what to do and they'll work it out, right? That's kind of the philosophy that seems to dominate a lot of the state energy policy. And to me, so as an educator, I see this as a challenge of education because energy economics, I'm trying to redefine it more broadly because a lot of the energy economists that you've talked to are very responsive to this ideology that and the money that flows with it. That you can anytime you write a plan, help a state come up with a plan that gets you to net zero in 10 or 20 years. That's what they're trying to show, and that's what they want in the report. A lot of economists will figure out, how do you model it to show how you can get there, right? You can put
Right.
in tons and tons of batteries and tons of wind and solar, but they don't really get into the grid limitations or how the markets are affected. So to me, there's 6 disciplines. If you want to learn energy economics and be effective at policy, there's 6 areas you have to understand, and hopefully I'm working on online courses or an extension of how to teach and train on this. But the first is climate science, right? You got climate scientists that create fear and urgency. IPCC writes reports saying that bad things are going to happen. We got to do them quickly, and then that moves into policy. You got politicians, lawyers. You pass legislation, big climate bills that require reductions in emissions, right? So that whole policy machine feeds off of the science and the IPCC reports, right? And then next to that, you get into the economists, right? The economists try to interpret the policy and come up with a overall cost and overall pathways to decarbonization, and they say it can be done. And then next, the fourth discipline is the grid operator, the energy systems operator, right? They're the ones that have to figure out how to maintain a reliable, resilient, affordable grid in reaction to these new requirements, right? So what are the technical limits of operating a grid and a gas pipeline system and all the other systems? And then the fifth one is implementation. The businessmen that go out and build and operate plants, right? They're the ones that really build things. They get private investment, that they make these plants work, and they operate them. And then there's finally the technology side, the energy companies, the oil companies, the nuclear suppliers, the solar and wind producers. They're the ones that provide new technology, right? We got fusion coming around the corner. We've got Net Power has a combined cycle that captures all the CO2 coming out of it. You've got hydrogen powered combined cycles, if you can figure out how to get hydrogen there. So you got all these great technologies that try to respond to all these other things. But until you take a look at all 6 and put them next to each other and get each one to understand what the other 6 parties need and want and how they think, I think that's what's needed to really understand energy economics. And it's very difficult to pull all those together. But that's what I tried to do when I started teaching at graduate level in the survey course, and it's incredibly difficult to make all those connections. But that's my challenge. That's what I'm retired. I'm 72. Whatever I can do to push the educational side in the right direction, working with multiple universities and figuring out how to do things online more effectively. So that's what drives me right now, Robert, in terms of what your comment was.
I got you. Well, so I'll read it back to you because I think you've answered my question, and it took you a while, and I'm not gigging you for it, but it's because, well, so why do so few people understand the grid and the workings of the grid? It's because they have to understand all of those 6 disciplines: the climate science, policy, economics, grid operations, implementation, and technology. And you have to be conversant or even an expert in all of them. And maybe okay, so of all of those, maybe those, in my view, I think about, well, the last, do I have to be an expert on climate science? Well, maybe not. If the goal is to reduce CO2, I can just say, okay, well, I accept that. But still, you've got to think, well, okay, what's the policy? What is going to work in the real world if I pass a law or some regulation? And then the economics, well, what's it going to cost? Because that's going to affect the policy. And then the last 3, grid operations, implementation, technology. So as I'm going to use my friend Lee Cordner's line, which I've used many times now: where are you going to put it? How are you going to connect it? And how are you going to pay for it? Right. So those are the things, those are the key drivers. But I think you've answered my question in a very robust way. Why do so few people understand? It's goddamn complicated. That's why. And it's only, and I'll say this as well, and this is a bias that I've had on this podcast. I like interviewing older people rather than younger people because they have more experience and have more ability to understand more disciplines. And I think that that's part of it as well. Is it not that there aren't that many gray heads, and I'll say that word, that are really want to be engaged in these kinds of issues and have the enough experience to be able to say, no, this is the right way or this is the wrong way. Am I on track here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the understanding enough of all these areas keeps you from getting carried away with one ideology or one set of objectives. You know, you can, there's a long history to environmental regulation in the US, right? We used to have a lot of coal plants, and we gradually regulated the coal plants more and more to reduce air pollution and wastewater discharges, and soon it became uneconomical. But the process of applying regulations and passing climate legislation and not environmental legislation, you know, was a logical progression that considered economics, it considered the technology, it considered how it would impact plants that operate. There was a good logical sequence there. And now we're not really doing that, right? We're imposing restrictions, limits on CO2 emissions that don't work their way around the important disciplines that have to factor into that. Part of it might not be unintentional, right? I mean, you've got special interests promoting different technologies. You've got this ideology that might not want to consider economics because it's, you know, how do you get to net zero if you consider economics, right? If your job is to develop policy to get you to net zero, and you come back and say, well, geez, it's not really economic or feasible to get there anymore, what happens to your job, right? So
Right.
there's a lot of embedded motivations that aren't just educational. It's part of this whole, you know, we got what, $14 billion a year of climate funding that filters its way into many different agencies and organizations with kind of a blind purpose, right?
Well, I think I'm really glad that you laid out those 6 points, Reiner, because it's, you know, I've thought about these issues for a while, and I've had a lot of guests on the podcast, and I write a lot about it, but I haven't had as clear an outline for how all of these have to come together. Because as you're saying it too, what I'm seeing over and over is a whole lot of policy specialists, and these are as I see it, these are the NGOs. The climate groups, I don't call them green groups, and I don't even call them environmental groups anymore. They're NGO activist groups who they have one purpose, and it's to push a specific policy, whether that's natural gas bans or more renewables or whatever. And so they have one focus and one focus only, and that's the policy and getting the policy implemented. And all the rest of this is of no interest to them. And they measure their success by implementing policy and nothing else, right? We got this bill passed or we got this regulation passed. We got California to ban natural gas use in the home and commercial businesses beginning. That's a policy win. Everything else we don't care about because it's climate science, or I guess you could say it's tied to the first one, right? But I'm just reflecting back because I haven't thought about it in these ways, but I think that outline really helps me understand what this is all about and what the different interest groups are. And so much of the money and the momentum and the media is behind only the policy part and none of the rest.
Yeah, and if you look at those 6 disciplines I mentioned and you go back and review all your podcasts, Robert, you've done an excellent job at populating a lot of the different aspects of that, right? You had Steve Koonin on to talk about interpretation of climate science. You've got people from different industries talking about how the fossil markets are changing and how your podcasts have done an excellent job of trying to capture those 6 areas. And I encourage you to keep looking and bringing in people from each of those areas to do that. And that's one of the reasons I'm very interested in your podcasts, because it really carries the same areas of emphasis as the areas that I'm interested in.
Well, thank you. That's a very kind compliment. Well, let's talk about implementation then, because you're in New England, and like other parts of the country, it's very constrained in terms of topography, in terms of geography, population, et cetera. So you've talked about the possibility, and I'm going to use that word here very purposely, the possibility of increased renewable energy deployment in New England. But here's the question. Is it even feasible? I mean, is it even possible that given the land use constraints and the opposition to wind and solar, which is happening all across the country, and this is, an ongoing issue and one thing that sticks in my craw with these policy analysts at elite universities. Oh, we're just going to build terawatts of new solar and wind. The fuck you are. Forgive me. It's my podcast. I can use that word, but you're not. No, because the land use conflict. So here's the question. What is even the possibility that New England could, with $60 billion, that they could build out the amount of wind and solar that is outlined and build the amount of high voltage transmission that would be required? Is it even possible in your view in New England, given the active nature of a lot of groups and local governments in New England opposing wind and solar? You can't build wind in Vermont. Is it even possible for New England? This is the question. Is it even possible for New England to do a large scale build out of renewables given those land use constraints?
Well, I attended a hearing last week where I testified a little bit on the economics of the New England Massachusetts climate plan, but most of the other people that objected to the plan objected on the basis of land use and deforestation and the land impacts of extending wind farms and even solar farms. I think wind was probably the biggest, one of the bigger issues. And I think it would be very difficult to get anywhere near the doubling that they're projecting for solar and wind, just because of the public opposition on the basis of land use, and transmission requires new rights of way and everything that's extremely difficult to develop. The easy part from the policy standpoint is offshore wind, right? If you think about it, they do this 100 miles from the coastline. People can't see it. The groups that object are probably the fishing industry, or if there's shipping lanes or
Right.
maybe bird strikes. So the opposition is much smaller, and the way these projects are sold are through offtake agreements with the distribution companies. So,
Right.
and if you try to understand what's going on and you request all the documents, these contracts, how much are they going to pay? How much the prices go up? Are we paying 3 or 4 times what the wholesale price is for this? It's all redacted, right? It's a competitive process. So if you request a copy of proposals or agreements, you get one that's all blacked out. All the numbers are gone. So it's very difficult for the public to participate in a full understanding of what they're going to be paying for. But as a transaction, the utility regulator tells the distribution companies that they have to enter into these agreements.
Right.
And I'm not sure what kind of a public process is there to recognize what's going on until it's too late, right? So you get a policy home run, because it's a lot easier to develop these projects offshore that are financed based on offtake agreements to distribution companies with Public Utility Commission approval and limited public input than to try to get 100 new wind farms built onshore, right?
Right. And therein is where the economics part comes in and gets ignored purposely, I would say, in many cases, because I just think offshore wind is a loser. I've thought it's a loser for a long time. We've heard lots of projections about, massive increases. This is going to happen. And I look at it, I think, no, it's not going to happen. It's too expensive. And
Well,
anything in saltwater is a bad idea. I mean, saltwater is just a terrible environment. So you're going to put these massive machines out in the middle of the deep ocean. And then you have the problem of bringing that power on shore. But anyway, but just to drive this point home. So you're saying you attended this hearing last week that most of the speakers who are opposition to the renewables plan were talking about land use issues.
Yeah, I mean, that was several of the speakers were concerned about losing trees and having big land use impacts in areas that were undisturbed. If you look at the footprint of a wind farm with access roads and the foundation work and the
Right.
transmission, it leaves a pretty big footprint. And I think most people don't understand the economics, right? Because the state energy offices are even saying, oh, it's going to save you money,
Right.
right? And they're not doing rate studies. And they should be asked to do rate impact studies because your electric bill could double or triple in the next 10 years to pay for these things, right? And they're telling us that, oh, it's not going to cost very much, and solar and wind are getting cheaper and cheaper every year, and we should just build as much as we can, right? So
Right.
that's you're getting this soft sell on the economics that avoids the primary costs and rate impacts, which, I think that's the next step, is to really get the state energy offices to be honest about rate impacts, because that would create some public resistance very quickly against these big offshore wind farms. If people realize they're going to pay, 3 or 4 times as much for a significant portion of their electricity. Remember with regulated utilities, how difficult it was to get a rate increase,
Hmm.
right? The utility wanted to build a nuclear power plant, and there's a decade of discussion on how much electric rates would go up to pay for that, and whether you really needed the power, and now with a deregulated grid, and you don't have central planning, you don't have integrated resource planning that says, well, wait a minute, offshore wind is going to be a very expensive way to do it. Plus, it's going to make power at the same time that the nukes do. And we shouldn't do this from a planning standpoint. That integrated resource planning isn't there anymore, right? Now you've got the wind industry coming in, pushing, lobbying, the policy people saying, oh, this is a lot easier than onshore renewables development. It happens, and it's if you look at the New York and New England plans, they're talking about tens of gigawatts of offshore wind coming in very quickly over the next couple of decades, right?
Right.
So that's what keeps me up at early in the morning at 4 o'clock when the freight train rolls through my head with all of the stuff that's happening, that keeps me working instead of just enjoying retirement. But
Well, I think, and it's so important, Reiner, what you're doing, because I think that this is because electricity bills touch everyone, right? And it's going to be we're seeing rates are going up all across the country, partly because of higher gas prices, but some of the other things we talked about. But let me ask a specific question, excuse me, about nuclear, because it's one that I think is important. And I've heard other people say this, that nuclear just can't. Nuclear power plants, Texas might be an exception. But in these deregulated, what did Ken Lake called them, reorganized markets, or that wasn't his term of art. But the deregulated markets, can nuclear power plants be successful in deregulated markets, or do they need a regulated system because that will assure their return on investment?
I think for existing plants, as long as gas prices stay high and they get some subsidies, they're okay owned by unregulated subsidiaries. But if you're going to build anything new, and if you start looking 2030 to 2040, and we're looking at New York's plan with very ambitious growth, and you start doing electrification, right? You start putting in charging stations for cars and heat pumps. That's going to require a huge amount of new capacity,
Right.
right? And the New York plan, it's kind of funny because it was written by the guys at ISO New York, who have to be very positive about everything when they write these things.
Right.
So
Yeah.
so they're saying, wow, it's going to require an unprecedented level of development. You got 7 years to put in 50 gigawatts or something. There's no way, right? And and then when we're trying to put this model together, well, what is the new capacity going to be, right? It has to be a clean, flexible, and reliable generation. So how can you do that, right? If you left the market to its own devices, people would build more gas plants, because obviously that's the cheapest. You'd have to bring in more gas supply, which is difficult.
Right.
Now you got people saying, well, we can have hydrogen powered combined cycles. You put in a cavern, you put in hydrolyzers, and you make hydrogen with electricity, put it in a cavern, and then you can run a combined cycle plant without any emissions, right? Now that's kind of puzzling, because it takes a lot of energy to make the hydrogen. Is that going to create CO2? There's other technologies like net power, who they use a supercritical CO2 cycle, and they
Right.
produce high pressure CO2 that you could pump into the ground, or if there's any place you can do enhanced oil recovery, you can produce more oil with that CO2. There's a lot of markets for that. But, they're not really designed to operate as peakers. They want to run all the time and trying to find something that matches. So the best thing that we came up with was advanced SMRs, where you design the nuclear SMR with a nuclear island that runs all the time, right? And
Right.
most of your money is in the nuclear island. It's got to run 24/7. And you store the energy as hot salt. And then you design a power block that matches the market, right?
I
So if you
see.
need peaking, if you need cycling to fill in between renewables, try to make it behave like a combined cycle plant. And most nuclear designs don't lend themselves to that, right? So, I'm hoping to work, and I've done a lot of work in the SMR industry before I retired. But my message to them is look at your market. If you're going to replace combined cycle plants after 2030, you've got to look and act and smell like a combined cycle plant from a performance standpoint. And
That's interesting.
some of them get that, and some of them are still using kind of a traditional design because nuclear reactors don't like to change load, right? So you
Right.
got to figure out a way
Let
to
me,
do that.
if I can just interject one quick thing about the hydrogen, which I think is just worth noting. Well, one, I've driven fuel cell vehicles, and I rode in the first one 30 years ago. I haven't seen any fuel cells lately. I haven't seen any fuel cells in a very long time. So I'm skeptical on hydrogen. But the thing about the alum cycle, it's interesting, right? About this idea of being able to separate, but it all depends on oxygen separation at the front end, right? I mean, you have to produce a tremendous amount of oxygen in the first place, right? So it's not just as simple as this.
Yeah, they put in an air separation unit. It's well-known technology, right? You chill the air and you can make all these gases as byproducts. You can sell argon and and other precious gases to the point that there's a market for them, right? If you're
Right.
up in upstate New York, there might not be a lot of people buying argon from you or something. But there's a lot. This is why you have to go back to the technology side, right? You got to understand where the technologies are going to fit and where they don't. And a lot of these state planning climate plans require a huge expansion of generation without having figured out what it's going to be.
Well, and that's key, I think, in your point on New York, and I've looked at some of the snippets from that report, and it was it, they essentially say, well, we need these firm, dispatchable, zero carbon systems that don't exist. They don't say it quite that way, but that's what they say, so that in fact, when in the list of the six disciplines, then when it comes to the technology then suddenly shoots to the head of the line, right? Where then, okay, we'll start with the technology. Well, then how did the economics and the implementation and the policy then work after if this is the technology? So I see what, this outline is very helpful to think about, okay, well, how's this going to work, right? And which thing has to come next? So we've been talking for more than an hour now, Reiner, and I like to keep my podcast at about that length. And this has been great. It's been I'm really glad to get the update on what you've been doing. Again, my guest is Reiner Kuhr. He is based in Cape Cod. Lucky guy. He's written a report about, it's called The Technical and Economic Limits for Renewable Power Integration in New England. You can find him on LinkedIn and also at the Center for Academic Collaboration Initiatives, centeraci.com. I don't know if I asked you this question before, Reiner, when you were on the podcast now more than a year ago. Who are your heroes? Who do you look up to when you're a guy who's done a lot of work in science, engineering, technology, economics? Who are your heroes?
Um, I don't know. I guess the heroes are the people that are out there trying to improve how we understand things. Lomborg is making a good case for the social cost of doing too much for decarbonization.
Mm-hmm.
You've got people that are the climate science side. Lindquist, they had that lawsuit informational lawsuit in Louisiana. Have you seen that? Where they
I'm not sure I
challenged.
have. No.
They showed that the IPCC came up with a technical report saying that there was high uncertainty in connecting CO2 emissions with temperature rise, and then the report for policymakers flipped that around. I'll send you a link to that, but
Okay.
that might be an interesting interview, right? So,
Sure.
does the IPCC honestly interpret for policymakers what the scientists came up with? So it's very difficult to stand up to that. And my heroes are the guys that aren't afraid of them and aren't afraid of the huge funding that is pushing this ideology that arbitrarily seeks elimination of fossil fuels. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but
No, that's fine. So, what are you reading? I have two more questions. What are you reading these days? Any books on the top of your list there?
well, I've been I like to cycle between historical fiction and science fiction. I don't have to read science fiction anymore because I get to read all these state implementation plans. But I have a friend that writes a
I don't
series
have
of
to read
books.
science fiction. I have the New York ISO.
So there's a guy, William Walker, who has written a series of books about between World War I and World War II. And the first one was Danzig and a spy in Vienna. And I enjoy reading historical fiction, and he's a good writer. I think it's fun to go back and revisit other periods in history when a lot of people were trying to do strange things. Hitler was trying to take over Europe. Britain was promoting pacifism. Be nice to Hitler and he won't hurt anybody. And until he starts taking over parts of Europe, and we don't always learn from our mistakes historically. And now with Putin and Russia and his energy war there, as some of your speakers have described. It's interesting to go back and read about history. The other thing I'm reading a lot about, and it's not really through books, but nutrition. If you there was a book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, that started to talk about how the medical industry is very responsive to food industry promoted research and
Mm-hmm.
pharmaceutical industry research. And there's a lot of people talking about how your body operates with food and your body as a power system. Your
Mm-hmm.
body uses certain forms of. So I'm very fascinated by that. And I'm on a low carb diet, and keto diets really reflect some of this thinking that's outside the current medical industry. So I'm enjoying that kind of reading as well.
So I did neglect, and given your German heritage, I neglected to ask you. So, what's your take? Just give me your quick take on what's happening in Europe. My take is they drove themselves into the ditch. This was something that there was a policy, as my Bjorn Peters, who is we just released a podcast with him. He said this is a policy driven situation. The policy drove them to this. What's your quick take on the energy crisis in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I actually watched a lot of your podcasts and learned from some of the speakers about the background and how there might have been influence from Russia and China that discouraged fracking and suggested shutting down the coal industry and
Right.
exaggerating the risks of operating nuclear plants. So it sounds like it could have been a well orchestrated long-term plan to support Putin's attempt to get some property back. I think the war is going to end soon because they're almost at a stalemate. Putin is trying to hold on to whatever he can and threaten things that could push to an earlier end of the war. So I hope there's something that happens soon I'm sure the politicians will step in and try to do something before a lot of additional unnecessary damage is done. Putin's trying to take out a lot of the infrastructure now
Yeah.
in the Ukraine, right? So
It's
he's
terrible.
just trying to hurt them as much as he can to get them to the table and salvage some of what he's got. And if the war does end, what does that do to the world's energy situation? That would be an interesting topic for one of your future interviews, right?
So that's a good idea. So my last question then, and it will be the last one, Reiner, what gives you hope?
Well, I think working with young people at different colleges and universities and seeing that there's growing recognition of what the limitations to these policies are. I think there will be a strong response over the next, I don't see it in this election, but maybe in the next election cycle. Somebody will start taking energy more seriously as part of their candidacy and recognize the cost and inflationary implications of some of these policies. So I see the beginnings of some of that, in terms of hope related to a better understanding of energy economics. But I see it. I think there's a lot of brilliant people out there, and they just have to put the pieces together, and it'll happen.
Well, as a friend of mine said, "From your lips to God's ears" is, I think, the old phrase. So I'll hope for that. Well, listen, Reiner, it's been great. We've talked more than an hour, so I want to bring this to an end. But again, my guest has been Reiner Kuhr. You can find him on the interweb. He's on LinkedIn and at centeraci.com. Reiner, thanks for being on the Power Hungry podcast. It's great fun.
Thank you, Robert. It was a pleasure.
And to all you in podcast land, tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.